Good evening, everybody. I think we'll wait for a few more people before we get formally launched. But my name is John McDougall. I am one of the co-chairs of the 350 Mass Transportation Working Group. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar called Commuter Rail to Regional Rail, Better Transportation, Less Pollution. What I thought we might do is wait a little bit in case some more people call in. And while we're doing that, could I ask everybody to do us a favor, which is, if you can, post in the chat, post your name, post pronouns that you prefer to use. And then if you would, if you know, post the closest commuter rail to where you live, the closest commuter rail line to where you live. If you don't know that, just post the city or town that you live in. So as I say, your name, pronouns, closest commuter rail. So, great, we see some names coming up. Okay. Maybe just hold the time. Just wait a little bit more.
Got 2 Lowell lines, 1 Fitchburg line so far.
Okay.
2 Fitchburg line now.
Fitchburg, okay.
Right.
So they say if you've just joined, we're asking you to put, if you would, in the chat, your name, your preferred pronouns, and also whatever is the closest commuter rail line to where you live. If you know that. If you don't know which is your nearest commuter rail line, just put down your city or your town where you live. And we're doing that because we would really like to have part of this whole webinar be quite interactive, to try to find ways that all of us can be engaged in what to me is a really exciting project, but a long-term one, which needs work by everybody. So that will be a really excellent thing to get some participation from people. Okay. Okay, so I got 28, okay. Okay, so maybe we will get started. And as I say, I'm excited to see a bunch of people who I believe come from several different, parts of 350 Mass, and I see 1 or 2 faces from outside 350 Mass. That's great. Everybody's welcome on this hot, steamy evening, but hopefully people are managing to stay cool. And before I introduce our speaker, I would just like to ask everybody, please mute yourselves. Maybe we can have our tech team automatically mute you, but if you would also take care of that. And we have actually started recording. What we'll do is record the presentation that will happen in a few minutes. We'll also record the question and answer period. We will then go into breakout groups, and I'll spell this out in a few minutes. And the breakout groups will not be recorded. And then after the breakout groups, we will reconvene for a final set of reports from the breakout groups, and those reports will also be recorded. So we will be doing some recording, and later on we will send you the links to the recordings. I would also like to thank people who've been tremendously helpful in making this evening's webinar possible. First and foremost, our guest speaker, who I'll introduce momentarily, Ethan Finlan, and I believe there are 1 or 2 other folks from Transit Matters. Yeah, do I see Jay from Transit Matters? Hi, Jay. Jay is the Transit Matters bus guru. Is there anybody else from Transit Matters, Ethan, that's joined us tonight, if you can tell?
Yes, Alon, our technical advocacy. I think their official title is technical advocacy lead, but they work with me on regional rail very extensively.
Fantastic, great, okay. So this has been really one of the exciting parts of all of this, is collaboration with Transit Matters, for whom I have a huge respect. I'd also like to thank our tech team, Sam Payne from the Better Future Project staff. Say hi to Sam, good to have you with us. And Ann Munson, who is helping out with tech, and also Anne has been tremendously helpful and is, as some of us know, as the chair of the 350 Mass State Steering Team. So thanks a lot to Anne. We also have a bunch of people who will help facilitate the breakout groups later on, and maybe wave to everybody if you are a breakout group leader. I believe we have, and correct me if I miss people, Judith Black, Sam Buck, Sylvia Parsons, Steve Miller. Is there anybody else I've missed who's doing some breakout group leadership? Anyway, thanks for all of that. And if there's any, oh, it occurred to me, since this did go out beyond the 350 Mass network, it's conceivable, is there anybody here tonight who's some kind of elected official? Maybe that would include, you know, select people or planning board people even, you know, from some city or town. Okay, because that can happen. Okay. Okay, so once again, thanks. And once again, a reminder to put in your chat, your name, your pronouns, your nearest commuter rail station. So I'll quickly go over the format for what we'll do tonight. So in a few minutes, we'll have the presentation by Ethan. That will be followed by a question and answer period, following up on things that Ethan will have shared with us. We will then have breakout groups. And the point of the breakout groups is that we will have them based on particular regional rail line, commuter rail lines. Regional rail is the hope, commuter rail is the reality right now. And so we're going to have people in the breakout groups brainstorm ways to really make this transformation into a regional rail system a reality based on particular lines. And hopefully we'll have something like 20 minutes for the breakout groups to really get down to work, so to speak. And then we'll come back at the end to share some of the key things that have come up in each of the breakout groups. If you do have questions or comments, please hold on your questions, comments till the end of Ethan's presentation. You can certainly put things in the chat. As I mentioned, Lucia will be monitoring the chat for us. And also what we'll hopefully do by the end of tonight, and particularly we can perhaps use the breakout groups for that, is we can recruit some new people to get involved in this whole exciting project. And again, we'll encourage people to share their contact information, and we'll follow up particularly with people who do that. But we'll only use that contact information for the purposes of this follow-up, not for broader things. So you may have seen in today's Boston Globe, there was an editorial on the Mass Bay Transportation Authority, MBTA. And what the Globe editorial board did was they interviewed Steve Poftak, who is the general manager of the T. And then they commented at the end of summarizing his main points in the interview. They said, quote, as described by Poftak, the T's plan for post-pandemic life so far, the T's plan is a series of baby steps forward and some steps backward. Not a very encouraging summary. By contrast, some of us a week ago were present at what I find was an exciting, kind of depressing, but brilliant and exciting webinar, also organized by 350 Mass, on the topic of power in the state legislature in Boston. And after we had a presentation of the results of the study by some people from Brown University, after that, we heard some comments from State Rep Mike Connolly, one of my heroes in the legislature. So what Mike talked about was how we absolutely have to have major transformative changes. They're absolutely crucial if we're really going to deal with climate change. And Mike said, you know, there are clearly some good things going on in the legislature. The new roadmap bill is really crucial, but that's not enough. So it seems to me that one way that we can really make these transformative changes is to make this big, big transformation in what's now called the commuter rail system. So for that, as I say, I'm enormously indebted to the work of Transit Matters And the Transit Matters guru on this, Ethan, will be our presenter in just a moment. Ethan has done a lot of writing about various aspects of rail transportation and other things as well. He's a freelance writer. And so I think that's enough by way of introduction. So over to you, Ethan.
Thanks, John, for that wonderful introduction, and for your kind words about the work that Transit Matters has been doing. And we wanted to extend those to you and to 350 as well. We know you're all doing a lot of really important work on the urgent issue of improving our approach to how energy is produced and what energy sources we're using. And I think your comments introducing sort of the general vision for transit being kind of lacking in the post-COVID world are very salient, because traffic is already coming back. Frankly, it's been coming back since last June, not even this June, last June. And if we see a smaller T, which is what some of the moves or I should say some of the inactions that have been taken by the state thus far proceed, that's going to be the future. It's going to be everyone driving around and not using transit unless you have no other choice. And for the folks who have no other choice, there will be disinvestment and a worse system, and will continue to cook the planet, just being very blunt. So that's something that needs to be reversed. Telecommuting won't save us, as we've seen. Vehicle miles traveled have already picked up. Didn't even go down nearly as much as transit miles traveled sort of during the height of the lockdown. So the future of transportation is really something that's dictated by our choices, and not by sort of vague notions of everyone telecommuting forever, because first of all, that's not possible. Second of all, it's not what's happening. So in that context, last summer, we had already been working on sort of the regional rail vision for quite some time, and then sort of responding to the MBTA's decision the previous fall, or the MBTA's board, I should say, to start this transition. We started sketching out, well, what should phase one of regional rail look like? And that's the sort of the theme of the presentation that I'm going to give, in addition to some sort of general themes that John, Lucia, and I talked about over the last few weeks. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump right in. I'll share my screen. I was certain there was a way to start the presentation before the screen shared, but I suppose not. One would think I'd be used to this after a year or more, but oh well. So this is talking about laying the first tracks to recovery, is what we called the plan. And this is a plan to start not only modernizing the 3 lines that the MBTA's board sort of highlighted back in November of 2019 as being the first, which should see full modernization, but providing better service system-wide. So because electrification is going to take some time, but starting that transition to sort of a more frequent service model. So just a little bit about Transit Matters. We're an organization that's dedicated to looking at how does transit work in countries where it gets used far more, and how can we bring those practices to Metro Boston and to New England. So we're sort of a very technically focused group, but we're also working to be very engaged with the people who ride the T every day. You know, we like to say we're data driven, but people focused, because our goal is to implement plans and policies that make transit effective, convenient, and equitable. So just coming back to the issue about COVID and transit, obviously all transit modes were hit hard by the pandemic, are starting to recover now, but commuter rail was the hardest hit mode. By some estimates, at the height of the shelter in place orders last year, commuter rail ridership was down 99%. But you know, the bus system had a lot fewer decreases. And why is that? And part of that is, a big part of that is because the bus system runs more frequently all day and it's more affordable. So more people can use it. Whereas commuter rail, as it exists now, is sort of exclusively geared around, you know, bringing white collar commuters from the suburbs into Boston in the morning and back in the evenings, with very sort of anemic service levels in the middle of the day. So while the ridership recovery is starting, you know, sort of now more than ever, where there's these questions about how you know, what are working schedules going to look like, and, you know, sort of moreover, how can we make all transit modes more equitable so more people can use them. So that means shifting to a new business model. That's one that provides economic mobility, so it's affordable, it provides access to jobs and just other opportunities in general, supports the new working options that might start to emerge and really were emerging pre-COVID, of sort of non-9 to 5 scheduling, and provides affordable service. So the system we're envisioning is one that every station in the commuter rail system would have a train at minimum every 15 minutes, you know, sort of inside 128 in the sort of denser suburbs, and then at least every half hour beyond. They'd be clean powered trains using overhead catenary, which is the most sort of effective power system. It's also the cleanest and most effective for sort of mid to long range rail. And it would have affordable fares with free connections, either timed to other services like the buses or in the suburbs, or with the subways and the more frequent bus routes. You know, they'd be coming so frequently, both would be coming so frequently that you wouldn't need to necessarily time it, but the connections would be as seamless as possible. And that model is what we call regional rail. So what is regional rail? So it's a business model that's based on 5 sort of key components centered around this idea of making commuter rail an affordable, reliable, and clean option for transportation all day. So achieving that requires system-wide electrification and buying high-performance modern electric trains, and I'll talk in more detail about that in a minute. High platforms and step-free access everywhere to speed up boarding for all riders and make the system more accessible. Making strategic infrastructure investments to sort of not necessarily double track everywhere in the system, but relieve key bottlenecks, that all day frequent service, and free transfers between regional trains, and fare equalization within the subway's service area. So this is, oh, I just muted myself. Can everyone hear me now? Great. So this is sort of the network-wide benefits of what we're calling phase 1 of regional rail. So as you can see, the lines that were authorized by the MBTA for this transition were the Providence line, the Fairmount line, and the inner Newburyport-Rockport line. And our vision is actually a little more ambitious than what the T originally put out, but in some ways, as time's gone on, it's gotten closer to what we're proposing. In addition to that, so sort of these 3 segments would see the full regional rail treatment on day 1 of of their opening, but all the other lines in the system would also have more frequent service as well. So what the goal is sort of these 5 points: a more resilient network, one with faster and more frequent service, one that's more reliable, and with the goal of, bringing down carbon emissions, not just by making the trains themselves cleaner with electrification, but also by making the trains a more competitive option and hopefully reducing single occupancy vehicle trips and that more accessible service as well. So one of the reasons why regional rail is so important for the region's sort of economic future is it provides much better transit service to gateway cities and environmental justice communities. So cities like Lynn or Lowell, for instance, where rail service exists, but it's so infrequent and expensive. And one other point is that the service has historically been unidirectional, meaning that there's more frequent service in one direction than the other, depending on the time of day. We propose equal service levels all day because that just serves far more commutes. So that makes it possible to actually get to jobs in Lowell, as opposed to everything funneling into Boston. So the resolutions passed by the Fiscal Management and Control Board in November 2019 called for starting this transition and building a system that's more similar to rapid transit. So the transition to regional rail has actually already begun. The MBTA has made some significant steps in terms of making service more frequent throughout the day on most lines. We actually just got the announcement that weekend service is going to come back in the near future. And it's going to be on sort of what we call a clock face pattern, where trains come at memorable intervals throughout the day. And that's how service is running right now with the schedule updates that were made, I want to say about 2 months ago, rather than, there being a 2:30 and a 4:55, there's a train at 2:30, then 3:30, then 4:30. In some cases, less frequent, but it's getting closer to that sort of. You don't have to look at a paper schedule to know when your train's coming. So what we'd like to see within the next year is more aggressive than that, and we believe that it's important to start rebuilding the commuter rail for the post-COVID world. So at least hourly service everywhere all day should be the goal, with an expanded Zone 1A. So right now, to go to Lynn, for instance, I think it's about $6.75 to go to Lynn from Boston. There was a pilot of cheaper fare service, but of cheaper fares, excuse me, but it didn't yield very many a very large ridership increase. Part of that was because ridership was just down across the board, but it was also partly because it wasn't marketed very well, and so the pilot was not extended. But we think these changes take time to display for the benefits to come in, but these are long-term investments, and we need to press forward with them. And expanding free transfers elsewhere. So the Fairmount line recently had free transfers to local buses implemented, and that's something we think should be done across the board. So while we're making those incremental steps, it's also important to start the process of planning and beginning the major investments needed to transform the system. So we would like to see electrified service on the 3 lines that I mentioned: Providence, Stoughton, Fairmount, and Inner Newburyport, Rockport, by the sort of the mid to late 2020s. Right now, the MBTA's best estimate is 2029 for beginning that transition. And by that, I mean for modernized service to begin. But we believe that with the investments and with that we're calling for, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation, it would be possible to achieve these much sooner. So what are these investments? Electrification, step-free access, and 15-minute all-day service on the early action lines, expanded high-level platforms across the system, and eliminating key bottlenecks like the single track pinch through Quincy to provide half-hourly service system-wide. So why is electrification so important? Well, EMUs are not only faster than diesel trains, but they're actually 5 to 20 times more reliable than the MBTA's current fleet. So one thing that's sort of caught on with some other railroads, and this question has been asked for a while, well, why can't we just use batteries? Because battery trains exist. There are in-service examples. Why don't we just use that instead of installing all this infrastructure? Well, overhead electrification is a proven technology, but battery trains are sort of limited in range, and the technology is still in its infancy. And even as battery technology evolves, overhead electrification will remain useful. And with that in mind, electrification is essential for meeting the state's zero emissions goal. Because if we can't get the services that the MBTA runs electrified, then it's just going to hamper progress elsewhere. Yes, electrification of private vehicles is important, but that in and of itself is not going to make the shifts that we need in order to tackle this crisis. And here's just a chart showing, the difference in reliability between the MBTA's diesel locomotive fleet now and the reliability of EMUs. How are we doing on time, John, by the way?
I think you're doing good, Ethan.
Okay. If you need me to stop, let me know, because I don't want to eat into the Q&A.
No, you're doing a great job.
Awesome. So one aspect of this that's so crucial is frequency, because once a train is running, every half hour to every hour throughout the day, as opposed to these sort of random times, more people will use it because, people like to be able to go places when they want to go to them. They don't want to have to rely on a schedule. Historically, one reason why the MBTA has been kind of reticent to look at a regional rail type model, or was prior to the rail vision process, was because there's this insistence that South Station needs to be expanded in order to run more frequent service. And that's just not true, based on other examples of countries where capacity has been boosted by 30 to 50%, even at stub end terminals like North and South Station. It's possible to get there by making some operational changes, like staging the crews so they're ready to take over for another one that's going on break, and updating the switches. And if you really want to know more than you ever thought you'd want to know about how switches at South Station work, I will link the proof of concept report we did a couple years ago in the chat. And making these changes makes it possible to accommodate even more trains than MassDOT plans with South Station expansion. So just talking again about how phase one will update these 3 lines. Sort of why were these ones chosen? The Providence-Stoughton line is the busiest one in the system, or was, I think it is still in absolute terms, actually the busiest line, although it hasn't retained quite as much of its ridership as a percentage of 2018 levels. It connects the biggest urban centers in New England, Boston and Providence. The Fairmount line serves dense environmental justice communities with riders who rely on slow, crowded buses, and who have some of the longest commute times the longest commute times, I believe, in the city of Boston. So fast, frequent subway-like service is really essential on that line, and we were pleased to see that the MBTA included it in phase one. The Boston to Beverly corridor is a somewhat similar situation. Even though that whole area is close geographically to Boston, historically the rail frequencies haven't been much better than, at peak it gets close to half hourly, or at least it did before COVID. But it's just not an option if you're commuting in the middle of the day. And Salem is actually the busiest station outside of Boston. So we think it's important to begin this transition by not only running service to Lynn, but also to Beverly. So these next few slides just talk a bit about the costs for making these transformations on each line. Just go through those sort of quickly, and I'll post a link to the reports after the presentation. One of the other improvements we propose making is in new stations. So at places like South Salem on the Newburyport-Rockport line, for instance, you can serve far more riders. And because modern electric trains take less time to get up to speed and slow down, that you can do that without a huge hit to the schedule. And the process of electrification will be a little more intricate on the Newburyport-Rockport inner line, which is sometimes called the environmental justice corridor, because there's no power supply on the north side, but it is possible to do that economically. And so I know we have some Metro West folks, so I wanted to talk a little bit about why it's so critical to get better service on the Framingham-Worcester line as soon as possible. Unfortunately, that wasn't included in the MBTA's 2019 resolutions, at least in terms of electrification, but there are critical steps that can be taken to improve service on that line, which is necessary because at some point there's going to be work on the Mass Pike, which is going to significantly impact trip times on the corridor for at least a decade. So we believe that it's possible to, in the short term, cut the express trip time down by 10 minutes or more by sort of banking the tracks through a process called super elevation and adding high-level platforms at all of the stations between Worcester and Framingham. And then we also include in this sort of sub-phase of phase one, half-hourly local service to Framingham, so trains making all stops, and then half-hourly express trains to Worcester. And yes, along the cost of substations is low tens of millions. Thanks for throwing that in there. This is just going through some of the investments that are needed. The Newton station's price tag, you'll notice this is significantly lower than what the MBTA is projected. We believe it's possible to get those costs down through taking some value engineering steps, like adjusting the location of the stairs, but that's a situation we're continuing to follow. And it is really important to make those investments because without them, Newton can't get all-day frequent service, and that impacts scheduling on the entire line. And another station we propose adding in phase one is West Station out in Alston to provide faster trips from that area, which I think there was one person in the chat who said they live near the B branch of the Green Line. So anyone who's taken that trip to get downtown knows that even a train every 15 minutes that's a little faster would be of benefit. And just talking about the cost of high-level platforms, we tried to sort of prioritize where they would go in the first phase, but high-level platforms are a net good in any case, because they make service more accessible for people with mobility constraints, and really anyone who has sort of a temporary injury, or even if you have bags and you're going from the airport or the train station. And removing some of the worst constraints in the system is also essential. One interesting point is that with electrification, you don't need to do quite as much double tracking as you would otherwise in order to run service more frequently. And that's just because electric trains are more reliable and can clear single track segments faster. So when we were putting this plan together, we didn't necessarily propose a bunch of double track work, even though some of the lines are going to be diesel powered for some time, just because it's not necessarily necessary to do a bunch of redundant work if you're beginning the transition to electrification. So some of the key bottlenecks are double track at JFK, UMass, and Quincy Center, or removing that bottleneck, I should say. There's also a cost in there for the doing some work with the Salem Tunnel, but that would be a very expensive overall project because it's widening a tunnel through downtown. And our report on the Newburyport-Rockport line demonstrates that you actually, with EMUs, you don't actually need to double that in order to get service at least as frequent as every 7.5 minutes. So talking about some of the benefits in terms of housing, if you have a train in both directions at least every half hour, it becomes more attractive to build housing near commuter rail, especially if the fares are affordable, because then people can live in places throughout the state and not have to rely on driving so much. Now that also means it's important that these be built as sort of neighborhoods and not just as housing developments near the train, because then you still need to drive to get to the grocery store or the like. But starting the process by running more frequent service is what's going to make that type of development more attractive. And then phase one alone, based on American Public Transit Association numbers, will generate over 22,000 direct jobs and an additional 23,000 indirect jobs. So how do we get there? And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this in Q&A and breakout sessions, but just two high level ideas, no pun intended. The first thing that needs to happen is that the legislature needs to provide the funding to support the transition to regional rail. And the second is that the MBTA needs to use that funding, so there needs to be enough financing to do this, to start building in-house planning capacity. Part of the reason why projects get so expensive is because they have to hire so many consultants, and that actually drives the cost up. So if you can have people on staff sort of permanently who can be constantly working on these projects, that makes this more economical, and it makes it easier to learn from best practices as well. So that's all I have for the presentation. I want to again thank 350 Mass for setting this up, and I'll give the floor back to John.
Oh, John, you're muted, I believe.
Can everybody hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
great. So thanks so much, Ethan. There's lots of ground that you covered, lots of information. So
I have some questions.
okay, who's
I'm Steve Brody.
Steve Brody. Okay, so maybe what we'll do is, if I may suggest,
Before we go in the breakout rooms, maybe do questions, and then do
okay, you're on first, Steve. Go ahead, please, Steve Brody.
Okay, I live in Norwood, which besides having the commuter rail on the Franklin line, also has the 34E bus service through Norwood, Dedham, originates in Walpole to Forest Hills. Now, how how can we implement or shift the cost? Is there any way that to shift the cost instead of using the bus service, which uses diesel to go to Forest Hills, and probably from there they go to Boston? That is, would there be some way for intercity small shuttle service to the railroad station? This would also impact Walpole, which also has a commuter rail station and is also served by the 34E bus line. What do you think, Ethan?
It's a great question, and that's actually something we're looking at quite extensively. Yeah, when you don't, when you have train service sort of along the same corridor as a bus route run, as like a really long bus route runs, you don't, that bus route does, especially if a lot of the ridership is connecting, you know, to the subway, as I suspect is the case with the 34E route going to Forest Hills. You don't necessarily, you know, that bus route doesn't need to keep necessarily serving that function. So you could, you know, use the resources and the drivers and the buses that you use on sending those buses all the way to Forest Hills to provide more frequent feeder service, you know, not just to the existing the stops served by the route right before the commuter rail, but potentially expanding those routes out further. Now that's something you want to be careful with because you know there's other destinations along the way that people might want to go to, but if you know sort of the main proportion of riders or people who are making that transfer, then yes, that does make the bus system a lot more efficient. Another example of that would be Lynn up on the North Shore, where a lot of the bus routes have, nearly all of them actually have to run all the way down to Wonderland to get the subway, get to the subway. But if you had frequent regional rail service, you need to do less of that.
Okay,
Stephen had a question.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead. Whoever.
Yeah,
I can't even see who's.
Stephen has a question.
I think Monty was on stack before me. Monty?
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Ethan about parking. I didn't hear anything about parking in your presentation, and I have primarily used the Anderson station where there's plenty of parking, but there are lots and lots of stations that have very tiny parking capacity. And is that an important issue, and is the T addressing that at all?
So it's definitely an important issue. The question is, does that need to all be served? Does that demand need to be served sort of by people driving and parking to at the stations? Right now, the answer is has been yes, because that's how there aren't sort of walkable communities near the stations. And to a certain extent, that's probably going to remain the case in some of the further outs at some of the further out stations. So certainly judicious parking addition is something that should be explored, but it should be done in sort of a thoughtful way that integrates, well, how can we look at sort of first last mile shuttle services? So, how can we use sort of existing parking lots, work out deals with grocery stores, for instance, that have large lots that aren't always at capacity. And then in the longer term, with rail service being more frequent, being able to build more near the train stations, which I know is controversial, especially in some parts of Massachusetts. But if we're going to be making this transition sort of away from high auto use, it's something that's going to need to be dealt with. That doesn't mean never expand parking at all. But in general, that's sort of been the, Salem, for instance, got a very large parking garage not too long ago. And that's a fairly walkable community that has a lot of bus routes. But as you say, some of the more rural stops where people do rely on driving more have very, very tiny lots. So it's sort of this reverse priority situation that I've always noticed. But
maybe we can take just,
I guess I'd just like
Okay,
to
please.
follow up on that because, for example, I live in Burlington, which is a relatively large community, and we don't have, I mean, it's not walking or bicycle distance to the transit stop at Anderson. And so, I mean, it's fine to build housing next to transit stations, but that's not where the bulk of the population lives. And, how are people who live in Burlington going to, you're not addressing the needs of a large portion of the population if you only provide service to people who live within a walking or bicycle distance from stations.
yeah, I think Anderson would be, is an example of something that's always going to be where it's always going to be important to provide that access. But because it's close to major highways, as you say, places like Burlington are sort of the center of population is much further from much further from the commuter rail. So yeah, again, I think sort of judicious expansion of parking. I think that would be a case where that would be warranted. And yeah, the MBTA should be exploring that in those cases. Well, our concern is that that it doesn't get all taken up by that aspect.
maybe we can just take one or two questions more because actually we're running a little bit behind schedule. We do want to have a decent amount of time for the breakout groups. And I can't easily see.
It's Steve Malagodi, I think would be next.
Okay.
Thank you. So I have I guess a conceptual question that's really spurred on by the maps that you put up earlier. You seem to be talking about a conversion of commuter rail to regional rail, and yet it looks like everybody's still thinking about this in relation to commuters going back and forth into Boston. Whereas a regional rail, it seemed to me, rather than being focused simply on commuters who may or may not exist in the future, if it's regional rail, then it should be about satisfying the needs of regions. So looking at your map, for instance, there's still no plans to connect Lowell, Lawrence, Worcester, etc. Many people who are in these cities don't necessarily want to go to Boston all the time. They want to, have some way of getting to other cities. So if all lines lead into Boston, how are you changing any thinking about whether it's regional rail or a commuter rail?
It's a great question, and unfortunately, part of the issue is just down to the cost of physically expanding the system. That doesn't mean that something like that shouldn't be considered. We think it absolutely should. And Lawrence, I think you said Lowell to Worcester was one of the examples you gave, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's pretty clear. It should be like a beltway around the city, so you can go from Salem to Lawrence to Lowell to Worcester, and then maybe another point on the southern line. But right now, I had to take somebody out. I had to take somebody out to the driver's license bureau in Fitchburg, I think it was, in Fitchburg, because the local DMV here is not open anymore. They needed an ID. it would take 9 hours on commuter rail to get from Lowell to Boston to Fitchburg. I could walk there faster, literally walk there faster. So, you know, I mean, that's just one example. To get from Lowell to Lawrence, you have to take a bus that runs once an hour. It takes about 45 minutes. It's 20 minutes, it's 18 miles away. It's ridiculous. So, I mean, you see what I'm saying? That you need to connect the region and just not keep thinking about Boston as the center of all interest.
Right. No, I would agree with that. So the question, we've sort of wrestled with how much time do we spend on talking about extensions of the system, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but we would agree that yes, in the long term, those sort of circumferential connections by rail are something that really, I mean, they should be explored now, because of the land acquisition and the feasibility of building those does present challenges. I think one sort of intermediate step that can be taken is just where the bus connections exist, making those more frequent and faster. So doing things like dedicated lanes on the highways, for instance, having timed connections at Lowell to a bus that goes to Lawrence, so you can make those connections by transit, would be a great step. Would be a great step forward. So yeah, we think it's 128 would be another example. So yeah, it's certainly important. It's not just about going north and south. It's about those east-west connections too. So yeah, that's a great point, Stephen.
So maybe what we could do is, could we go for another, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes? It'll take us a little beyond our 8:30 stop time, but certainly my discussion group was fabulous. I hope other people had good groups talking about their lines. And what I'd like to invite people to do is have one person, if people had a scribe, then maybe you can send that stuff into Sam and Anne, our team. But other than that, could we have people from each group mention one thing that was particularly exciting that came up into your own group? So I don't know which group would like to go first with reporting on what came up.
Seeing a hand from Monty.
Okay.
In our group, we were.
Which line were you on?
This is for the Lowell line.
Okay.
We had two things that were exciting. One was that we wanted the Lowell line extended to Manchester, New Hampshire. And second, that we talked about having, to make it a regional network, that we should have a train that ran along 128.
Okay.
And that if the train ran around 128 and had stations, that there's actually a lot of employment along 128 now. And so you could push for that, not just as an extra luxury, but a way for people to get to jobs.
Okay.
Because if you live in Lowell and you work in Lexington, you can't get there by public transportation. Right. And if you live in Lawrence and you want to work in Waltham, you can't get there by public transportation unless you go all the way into the city. And there are actually lots and lots of jobs now along 128. So I think that we were trying to think about how this becomes a regional network and not a feeder system into downtown Boston.
Okay, thank you. Okay, which group would like to go next?
I think that Judith Black is in the chat, so maybe she's going to go.
Okay.
So when you think about how do you change from a commuter to regional rail, it
By
has.
the way, which route did you work on? Which line, Judith?
North Shore, Rockport, Gloucester.
Great. Okay, thank you.
So we've got to thinking, okay, in going from commuter to regional, who really are your stakeholders? And we were thinking students, elders, people who can't drive their own cars anymore, who would really appreciate having that kind of flexibility, because when you're old and your car's taken away from you, you can be very isolated. So it could mean a lot, and they are an important voting group. Students who go to different high schools, junior colleges, public institutions could really use this. And then, of course, there were the usuals, people with climate concerns, businesses.
Not those crazies.
Right. And then it's about money, because of course, what stops it? Money. And there's not a lot of public money, and there's not much industry. You know, sometimes an industry will pay to have a train brought in, but the North Shore, for instance, has biotech companies like Biogen, who might be approached to improve the lines, and money could come in through TCI, municipal financing, and then that kind of private financing. And then finally, we talked about a lot of things, but we also thought about, why didn't the rate reduction in Lynn work? It should have worked. The buses there are so packed, you cannot breathe. Everybody uses them. And I found out that they did not promote among community organizations or let people know in their home language. So it wasn't in Khmer, it wasn't in Spanish, and those kinds of things become very important if you want to change the way people use their public transit system.
Thank you. Wow, you covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Judith. Which line would like to go next?
We can go, we're the Worcester line.
Worcester line,
And
okay.
yeah, the big thing that, well, the good thing was Worcester is putting in level boarding, which is wonderful. They're upgrading their station. The thing that the people most wanted was to know about when the weekend schedule was going to return and when increased frequency was going to return. And the biggest wish was for a north-south link as opposed to just the from Boston link. If I missed anything, please, somebody else add in.
That was it.
Okay. Let's see, who else do we have? Which lines do we have that are not yet covered?
I'll jump in on the Providence. Go
ahead.
And I'm actually going to ask if Corey and Peter would just give their summaries. Corey, would you do that?
Okay, I think you were looking for one big point. Maybe we'll give two.
Yeah, 2 points are fine.
Okay, so I think the aspect of synergy between different modes is really important here. So you have the trains, which everybody focuses on, but it's how you get that last mile to the train that also matters. And we were exploring the idea that bicycles should be more embedded into the sort of the psychology of how we move around, connecting the trains to our homes, and throwing in there in certain places that are not as local shuttles. And I think this was mentioned earlier in the presentation, but to really change the conversation that the government is having about how we build in the idea that people are in the habit of taking public transit, and to force them to make the connections between these different modes. Because we think it should be normal that you hop on a bike to get to the train and you leave it and it's a blue bike, and then you get on the train and you hop on a bike on the other end and get from there to your office building. And of course, we're the Providence Boston line, so we're also looking at 2 urban centers at either end, and then encouraging people. The other, I guess, big point that we were talking about was making transit, doing a better job of communications and making transit cool to use, to take the train, and to build this sort of form of habit into the way that people engage, sort of getting back and forth. You know, we hit on the issue of reverse commute and the fact that there aren't enough trains going frequently enough, whether the focus is on Boston, but it also should be focused in between and on Providence. So I'm trying planning to do the summary, but maybe someone else had another point.
Peter, do you want to add something?
Yeah, so what I'd like to add is we also discussed the need for increased frequency, so that with the current schedule that the T adopted. There is hourly now in both directions all day long. That's a great improvement. But really between the two cities, at minimum, it needs to be a half hour and probably going towards 15 minutes. Also, we talked about talking to the legislature and probably in both states, but also our congressional delegations also in both states, because politically people need to know this is really important and we need the support of the governments, federal and state.
Great. Thank you very much. A lot of good stuff in Worcester, on the way to Worcester. Let's see, who have we not heard from yet?
Here, I'll try the Franklin line.
Okay.
All right, I think one of the things I came away with, there's the commuter rail that goes through from Franklin, that goes through, includes Walpole, Norwood, and Dedham. And there's also the 34E bus that goes from Walpole through Norwood, Dedham on to Forest Hills. And someone suggested, might have been Jay, suggested that maybe the bus can be redirected. So now there are shuttle buses in each town where the people get on to bring them to the railroad station, because where the bus stops are is not necessarily near the railroad stations, even though Norwood has 3 railroad stations. So that was one thing, that maybe the shuttle bus, the big long buses could be replaced with regional shuttle buses to serve the railroad stations. And whether regional rail, as someone else said, is really a correct term, it's probably electrified rail, that someone said we're not going to be connecting Springfield with Attleboro. That's not going to be a direct connection. So therefore, it's really not a regional rail, as someone, Steve Martin pointed out. So unless someone else also from the Franklin line has anything, I don't know that Jay does, or.
Well, just
Carolyn,
a little bit about how South Acton is a very good example of like an integrated last mile system, in which there are like vans and shuttles from a number of places around. And so that almost 50%, it might even be a little more than 50% of the people now use one of those services to get to the station rather than park, even though there is a decent amount of parking there as well.
If I can just add one point, thank you. I was happen to be in this group, and a thing that's sort of connected with that is we have the regional transit agencies, which serve mainly outside of Route 128. But number one, they need desperately far more funding, and of course to electrify their buses. A lot of them don't run on weekends, for example. But in addition to that, connection between agencies is often really poor. Although now the Pioneer Valley Agency and the one in Worcester, they are connecting. So there are public transit buses you can use to go from, say, from Worcester to Amherst, but often that's lacking. That came up in our group. Any other thoughts from that group? Have we covered all of the different breakout groups? So I guess we're, well, at the end of our time. So thanks to everybody who joined us tonight. I hope you found this really helpful. And I am enormously grateful to our presenters, our very skilled breakout groups leaders, and our very skilled tech team. And am I right, Sam? The recording will be made available. We can send that out to certainly folks in Transit Matters, folks in 350 Mass. And Lucia, do we have in the chat information about how to reach you as one of our contact people in the Transportation Working Group of 350? If not, maybe we can post that. The Transportation Working Group actually will have a meeting a week from tonight, the 28th, 7 p.m. via Zoom. Everybody's welcome to that meeting. As I say, a week from tonight at 7. Any other last minute points?
No, would Ethan's presentation be available?
Yes, I can make that available, Steve.
Oh, that would be great. Thanks a lot. Okay.
You know, I'm just wondering, so you're saying, John, that next steps could be to come to TWG.
You're most welcome to that, yes.
Yeah, but we also have a transportation campaign that's trying to take shape in 350, and that might also be a place where these issues become prominent. So there'll be an opportunity to get involved in the transportation campaign coming up very shortly. And if people are interested in having regional rail be a big part of that, then come when you hear that coming up. I didn't say that well, but you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah, I believe what we're thinking, we've had some discussion, Anne, Sylvia, Lucia, and I, and we're thinking of some big event really after the summer in September, you know, but certainly if you're interested in learning more right now, as I say, hopefully Lucia's contact information is in the chat. And we can start having discussions before September.
Yes, they put the link to the website, and there's a contact us button on the website, and you just go through that and that gets us.
Right.
You get the link to the meeting.
Right.
The link to which meeting?
Well, there's one meeting a week from tonight, and I'm sure we haven't figured out the agenda, but I'm sure part of it will be to follow up from tonight about how to really work more on regional rail. But then, I mean, obviously what's come up in transportation issues is some other things like funding for the whole, you know, expansion of regional rail, but other things as well. And that's part of what we work on in the Transportation Working Group. So I'm sure that will be in our agenda for the broader transportation campaign. And then, of course, making everything electric, not just rail, but buses, is also a huge concern of ours and a priority in the Transportation Working Group. So that will be part of our broader transportation campaign. Okay. So, and if there's anybody who is new and is not, you know, regularly in contact with us, as the last thing, maybe put your contact information in the chat. We will keep this going. Our tech team and our facilitation team want to hang around for a little bit longer to kind of debrief, but, you know, stick that in the chat and we'll know how to reach you.
I just wanted to say, John, thanks again to you and Lucia for reaching out, and really enjoyed the opportunity to present. And I think we got some good feedback tonight, especially about, you know, the sort of cross-regional connections and the importance thereof. So thank you all for your excellent discussion.
Well, thanks so much to you, Ethan, you know, and all the other people in Transit Matters. I mean, as I say, as we saw in many, many different cases, you guys have done an incredible job of assembling all kinds of information and are, you know, trying to grapple with all the problems. So I'm immensely grateful for all of your work, and thanks for joining us tonight.